Welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, we looked at how Gustav III put an end to the Age of Liberty in Sweden with a coup in 1772. To begin with, the new regime was quite popular, not least thanks to a number of enlightened reforms that made the lives of regular people easier. But it's tricky to run a country, and soon the initial enthusiasm for Gustav's rule started to wear off. People objected to various aspects of Gustav's reign, such as the expansive and expensive and wasteful court, the rising national debt, and the corruption in political appointments. And, to make matters worse, the first half of the 1780s saw several years of crop failure. This was serious stuff in the 18th century, where the economy was almost completely dependent on agriculture, and the margins were small and starvation was only one or two bad harvests away. In all fairness, neither the king nor his revolution could be faulted for the bad weather that plagued the early 1780s, but people still pointed a blaming finger at the man with the top job, expecting him to fix things. Today, we'll have a look at what Gustav III did to try and regain his initial popularity. Episode 116, Wag the Dog. So what do you do if you're a king in late 18th century Europe and you want people to forget that they don't have enough food, or that you're wasting a ridiculous amount of money on your court, or that you're only appointing your buddies to all the best jobs in the country? Easy. You start a little war, of course. That's not only a great distraction, it's also a great way to gain some glory for your kingdom and yourself. So that's what Gustav III decided to do. To begin with, he planned to attempt what Karl XII had failed to do and conquer Norway from Denmark. But to do that, he needed the approval from the Russians, because Denmark and Russia were allies. Since Gustav and the Russian Empress Catherine II, also known as Catherine the Great, were first cousins, he thought he had a shot at convincing her to let him have Norway. The two cousins met in southeastern Finland in 1783, but to Gustav's chagrin, Catherine refused to give up her alliance with the Danes. That meant that an invasion of Norway was off the table. It did not, however, mean that Gustav had given up on the whole improve your popularity with a little war strategy. Not at all. He merely had to pick another target. And that target was pretty obvious. It had to be Russia. Not only had the Russians been advancing westward, gobbling up pieces of Swedish-held territory for the better part of a century by now, Empress Catherine had also annoyed him by refusing his request to ditch her alliance with Denmark. So from the mid-1780s onwards, Gustav was just waiting for the right moment to attack Russia. That moment came in the fall of 1787, when news reached Stockholm that a war had broken out between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. That meant that the Russians would be preoccupied with fighting on their southern border, leaving their northern flank exposed. There was just one small problem. According to the constitution Gustav himself had forced the estates to accept in 1772, the king wasn't allowed to start a war. Only the Riksdag could do that, and they weren't likely to agree to a war against Russia just to increase the king's popularity. Ignoring this minor detail, Gustav started to prepare for war that winter. He wanted a surprise attack on St. Petersburg as soon as the Baltic Sea would be navigable again in the spring. By landing large and unexpected forces in the suburbs of the Russian capital, he hoped to take the city and force Empress Catherine to sue for peace quickly. But the people who knew something about how wars are waged protested that it would be impossible for logistical reasons. They insisted that the army wouldn't be ready until sometime later in the summer. The king had no choice but to accept that. If nothing else, it gave him time to prepare the political ground for the upcoming conflict. He needed a solid excuse to start this war that he wasn't allowed to start. To begin with, the king presented a diplomatic report from an envoy in St. Petersburg to the Council of the Realm on May 22nd. The report painted a worrying picture of preparations for war in the Russian capital, and the members of the council were unsettled by this message. They were so unsettled that they approved Gustav's request to mobilize the army. But they also thought that the king should immediately send a letter to the Russian empress to clarify the situation. Gustav didn't waste any time on any correspondence with his cousin Catherine, though. You see, the report he presented had been a fake, completely made up to trick the council into agreeing to mobilization. So any Russian response was bound to contradict the content of the king's false report. So instead of waiting, he decided to set off to Finland to await the mobilizing army. So on June 23rd, the king stepped onto a ship at the embankment by the royal palace in Stockholm. It was a thoroughly planned scene, with members of the court as well as his wife and son there to witness it. The king was dressed up to look as martial as possible, even wielding a sword that had belonged to the warrior king Karl XII. Ladies of the court wept openly, and so did the crown prince, Gustav Adolf. Adding to the drama was the fact that June 23rd had also been the day that Gustavus Adolphus had set sail to join the 30 Years' War. It was hardly a coincidence that Gustav III, with his theatrical flair, had chosen the same date for his well-choreographed departure. The king had laid the groundwork, but he still needed the war to get going. Empress Catherine II of Russia had been watching the Swedish build-up for a long time, and she was no fool. She knew that her cousin was spoiling for a war, but she also knew that he couldn't start one without the consent of the Riksdag. And she wasn't going to give them any excuse to do so. The Russians were far too busy fighting the Ottomans in the south. But, as it turned out, Gustav III had a plan to get around both Catherine and the Riksdag. In secret, he'd ordered the tailors at the Royal Opera in Stockholm to sew Russian army uniforms. And now, Swedish soldiers were dressed up in these uniforms, and in the night between June 27th and 28th, they staged a fake attack on a Swedish border post. It would look like the Russians had attacked first, thereby giving Gustav III the right to declare a defensive war against Russia. On July 2nd, Gustav could finally send off an official declaration of war to Catherine II. Once that was done, he could put the plan in motion to conquer St. Petersburg. That meant that the fleet was of central importance to the war plans, both in order to neutralize the Russian fleet operating in the Gulf of Finland and to ship troops for the invasion. Unfortunately, the king's brother, Duke Karl, who was in command of the fleet, wasn't in any particular hurry to get out to sea, and the king was enraged when he returned to Helsinki on July 12th after having inspected the border region, only to realize that the fleet still hadn't left port. It took 2 more days for the fleet to get ready, and on July 14th it finally set sail. By that time, the Russian fleet had already spent almost 2 weeks taking control over the Gulf of Finland. The two fleets met on July 18th, north of the small island of Hoogland in the middle of the Gulf of Finland. The ensuing battle lasted for 6 hours. Opposing Duke Karl was the commander of the Russian fleet, who, unlike the king's brother, was a capable naval officer who actually had experience of warfare at sea. To Duke Karl's credit, though, it should be mentioned that he showed not only personal bravery, but also self-awareness by deferring to the officers nominally under his command, letting them call the shots during the battle. Already in the morning hours, the Swedes could hear the sound of guns firing from the Russian fleet, and around noon, the enemy fleet could be seen from the Swedish ships. Still, due to the light winds, it wasn't until 5 o'clock in the afternoon that the two sides were close enough to actually start shooting at each other. The battle itself lasted for about 6 hours until darkness fell at around 11 o'clock at night. The Russian fleet sustained far more damage than the Swedish one, but the Swedes ran out of ammunition and wasn't able to press home their advantage. So they had to return to port at Sveaborg, the naval fortress just south of Helsinki, and let the Russians retreat to their naval base, Kronstadt, at St. Petersburg, to repair their damaged ships. For that reason, the battle can be seen as a draw, but from a strategic perspective, that was all the Russians needed. The Swedes had needed to crush the Russian fleet to pave the way for a Swedish invasion overseas. To make matters worse, Sveaborg wasn't equipped to repair any ships or restock ammunition. It actually turned out that no one had remembered to order any ammunition at all for the ship's cannons, so it took forever to have more cannonballs made in Sweden and then shipped to Finland. In the end, the Swedish fleet didn't leave port for another 4 months, and when they did, it was only to sail back to its winter port at Karlskrona in southern Sweden. That meant that the whole original plan for the war, a quick takeover of the Russian capital, had to be scrapped. But that didn't mean the war was over. The king's BFF, Gustav Moritz Armfelt, led a smaller unit across the border already on July 12th. He had some initial success, but 2 days later the troops ran into a destroyed bridge and the advance stalled a few kilometers from Hamina, which had been in Russian hands since the War of the Hats. His uncle, Carl Gustav Armfelt, was in command of the main army, and was also moving in the direction of Hamina. On July 24th, the king left Helsinki and joined the army. He was looking forward to marching on St. Petersburg and forcing cousin Catherine to return all the land lost in the War of the Hats. But Gustav was in for an unpleasant surprise when he reached army headquarters on July 28th. It turned out that the camp was buzzing with discontent. The enthusiasm for the war was low, to say the least, and the troops complained that they lacked both food and supplies. And their complaints were justified. Just like in the Pomeranian War some 20 years earlier, the logistics were a complete mess. There was no standard caliber for the ammunition, and the offloading of supplies had been chaotic, leaving several units without the most basic things, such as socks and boots. It would be tricky to march barefoot to St. Petersburg. For Gustav, this was a rude awakening. He'd been convinced that everyone was as eager as him to invade Russia, and that his little war was enormously popular, because that's what everybody around him had been telling him. And soon, things took a turn for the worse. 3 days after the king's arrival, a mutiny broke out among the soldiers. 2 regiments decided to march off on their own accord, away from the front. With a bit of effort, the soldiers were convinced to turn back again, but no fewer than 180 officers resigned from their positions and left the army then and there. Naturally, the king was worried about the state of the army, but he didn't know half of it. In these early days of August 1788, a handful of very senior officers were conspiring against the king to try and end the war as soon as possible. In their view, that was the only thing they could do to avoid a complete catastrophe. So they got together and wrote a letter addressed to Empress Catherine II of Russia, where they stated that the war was illegal, started in violation of the constitution. Furthermore, they offered immediate peace and a return to the borders established in 1743, after the War of the Hats. It was decided that a guy called Johan Anders Jägerhorn, an officer from a Finnish noble family, should go to Russia and deliver this letter to the Empress. To explain his absence, the other conspirators claimed that he had been abducted by Cossacks. Jägerhorn was granted an audience with Catherine on August 15th, where he delivered both the written letter and an oral message, basically saying that among the Finns there was widespread support for the idea of establishing an autonomous Finland under Russian protection. While Jägerhorn was waiting around in St. Petersburg for the Empress to respond, things were happening back at Army HQ as well. By now, Gustav III had understood that something was going on, and he ordered General Armfelt to have his officers sign an oath of loyalty and allegiance to the king. But the move backfired. Instead, no fewer than 113 officers responded by signing the so-called Anjala Declaration, named after the Finnish village where the army headquarters were located in mid-August 1788. The declaration condemned the war as illegal and demanded that peace negotiations be started as soon as possible. In addition, the declaration called for the estates to gather and that the discarded constitution from the Age of Liberty be reinstated. As far as Gustav was concerned, this was treason. Meanwhile, back in St. Petersburg, Catherine II had formulated a response to Jägerhorn. But when he received it, he was bitterly disappointed. She wrote that she appreciated the sentiment, but that some kind of representative body of Finns had to declare independence and call on Russia to protect them if they wanted her to act. She also rejected the idea of an immediate end to the war. In other words, Jägerhorn's mission had failed. He rejoined the Swedish army in Anjala on August 23rd, and when he did, his co-conspirators were not only disappointed by Catherine's response, some of them were also upset by the bit about Finnish independence. That wasn't something they'd agreed to. Jägerhorn had basically offered Finland to the Russians on his own initiative, and to some of his co-conspirators, that sounded an awful lot like treachery. And they were right to be worried. The revelation that Jägerhorn more or less had offered Finland to the Russian Empress undermined the popularity and legitimacy of the Anjala Declaration in the eyes of many soldiers at the front. The idea of separatism also caused tension and fraction among the officers who had signed the declaration, and the initiative soon imploded. Jägerhorn himself soon returned across the border and ended up serving in the Russian army for the rest of the war. Crisis averted as far as Gustav III was concerned, and the end of August brought with it even more good news, namely a declaration of war from Copenhagen. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Russia and Denmark had a defensive pact against Sweden. The King of Sweden had worried about a Russian intervention if he'd attacked Norway, but the deal went both ways. So when Sweden invaded Russia, the Danes had no choice than to join the war, whether they wanted to or not. And at this particular point in time, they would have preferred to stay out of it. But a promise is a promise, so when the Russians demanded that Denmark attack Sweden to ease the pressure on Russia's northwestern front, the Danes prepared to join the fighting. When Gustav III received the news that Denmark had joined the war, he's supposed to have exclaimed, "I'm saved!" The king could now leave both the stalled war and the mutinous officer corps behind without it looking like he was fleeing the scene. Instead, he could credibly claim that he was returning to Sweden to rally the troops against the Danish threat. That threat materialized in the form of a relatively modest invasion force, crossing the border from Norway and pushing into the former Norwegian province of Bohuslän in late September. The Norwegian army continued southward along the coast without encountering much resistance. Sweden actually only had some 10,000 soldiers stationed west of the Baltic Sea at the time, and they were distributed throughout Sweden, from Scania in the south to Jämtland, another formerly Norwegian province, in the north. By October 6th, the Norwegian army had reached Gothenburg and demanded that the city surrender. It might very well have happened, because the man in charge of the city's defense was clearly not up for the job. He didn't know what to do, so he did nothing to prepare the defenses. But the king arrived in the nick of time, sacked the useless commander, and replaced him with someone who actually was willing and capable of doing the job. Thanks to this switch in leadership and the fact that the British ambassador to Copenhagen arrived to broker a temporary ceasefire, Gothenburg was saved. The temporary ceasefire was extended several times, all the way to the end of the war in fact. There would be no more fighting on this front. The Norwegian army left on November 12th and started the march back to Norway. Gustav III seized on this opportunity to declare victory in the war against Denmark. This war has become known as the Theatre War in Sweden. The name reflects the view that it wasn't a real war. The Danes were contractually obligated to attack, so they carried out a symbolic invasion and took the first opportunity to agree to a ceasefire and return home again. In other words, it was mostly theatre to placate the Russians. After all, only 8 Norwegian soldiers fell in battle during the whole conflict. But this rather frivolous name doesn't reflect the fact that even this war had its fair share of suffering and death. There may have only been 8 deaths in battle, but somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 Norwegian soldiers were lost due to hunger, disease, poor sanitary conditions, and exposure to the cold fall weather. In fact, the conflict is called the Lingonberry War in Denmark and Norway because their soldiers were forced to pick berries in the forests to keep starvation at bay, since their logistics were so bad. Meanwhile in Finland, the situation was also improving for Gustav, even though the war was far from over, or even going particularly well. But at least the mood in the army was improving. The troops had turned against their aristocratic officers when it became clear that they'd opened negotiations with the enemy behind the king's back, and even offered Finland to Russia. Gustav decided that it was now safe to return to the Finnish front and brought with him troop reinforcements and badly needed supplies. But the return of the king didn't change anything on the battlefield. The two armies spent the whole campaign season of 1789 attacking back and forth all over southeastern Finland, but nothing much changed on the map. Something needed to be done, so ahead of the third year of the war, the Swedes dusted off the original plan to land troops in the vicinity of St. Petersburg. They decided that a small force would attack north of Lake Ladoga to draw Russian troops away from the capital region, and then the Swedish fleet would swoop in and dump large numbers of troops in the suburbs of St. Petersburg to take the city and force the Russians to sue for peace. Just like in 1788, the plan hinged on the navy being able to control the Gulf of Finland. And since the Swedes didn't manage to neutralize the Russian fleet, the plan to end the war in one fell swoop had to be abandoned yet again. By mid-June, the last Swedish troops retreated back across the border to Finland. The Swedish fleet hadn't merely failed to take control over the Gulf of Finland, it was actually in a bit of trouble. There were some 30,000 men and almost 300 ships in the Gulf of Finland, which was an impressive force. But there was just one tiny little problem. The Russians had managed to trap them in the Bay of Viborg and were planning to annihilate the whole Swedish fleet. As if that wasn't bad enough, the king himself was on board one of the ships trapped in the bay. In the night between July 2nd and 3rd, the Russians attacked, but thanks to the heroism and tenacity of the crews of a handful of Swedish sloops and other small and low vessels equipped with cannons, the Russian ships were kept at bay, so to speak, for long enough for the Swedish fleet to push its way out into the open sea. Even though the lion's share of the Swedish fleet, not to mention the king, did manage to escape, the losses were significant. About a dozen ships and some 4,500 men never made it out. The event is called the Battle of Viborg Bay in English, but in Sweden it's known as the Viborg Gauntlet, and that's probably a more accurate description. In the days that followed, the Swedes raced westward. The High Seas Fleet sailed all the way to Sveaborg, the fortified naval base south of Helsinki, whereas the so-called Archipelago Fleet reassembled in a strait called Svensksund, or Ruotsinsalmi in Finnish, located between a number of islands, some 85 kilometers to the east of Helsinki. This was an ominous location. The previous summer, the Russians had inflicted considerable damage on the Swedish fleet at a battle here, and the Russian fleet was chasing after the Swedes this time as well, hoping to recreate that success and wipe out the Swedish ships that had slipped into the strait. The Russian commander, who was actually a German prince called Karl of Nassau-Siegen, was eager to finish the job from Viborg, and he wanted to finish off the Swedish archipelago fleet on July 9th, because that was the anniversary of Empress Catherine's accession to the Russian throne. The Swedish ships had some 14,000 men and 1,300 artillery pieces, but only 450 of them were heavy cannons. Based on reports from scouts, they figured out that the Russians were going to attack from the south, so they arranged the fleet in a horseshoe shape around the strait, with as little open water as possible between the ships and the surrounding islands. The thinking was that this formation would make it difficult for the Russians to surround any Swedish ships, and at the same time it would be possible to fire at the attacking Russians from 3 sides at once. To further increase the firepower, the Swedes had placed some artillery on the islands. The approaching Russian fleet carried some 18,500 men and 1,600 artillery pieces, of which at least 850 were heavy guns. That meant that the fleet under Nassau's command, preparing for an attack, was considerably larger than the Swedish one waiting in the strait. Around 8 o'clock in the morning on July 9th, 1790, Nassau's flagship Katarina gave the signal to attack. Half an hour later, the Swedes caught a first glimpse of the Russians and started to prepare for battle. 1 hour later, the southwesterly wind had brought the Russians close enough to start firing at the Swedes. Already in an early stage of the battle, it all could have ended when the captain of the Russian frigate Venus identified the ship carrying the King of Sweden. It wasn't too difficult since it flew the royal standard. Venus opened fire on the king's ship, and Gustav III had to escape the danger by quickly getting into a dinghy that carried him away to safety. Meanwhile, Venus came under heavy fire from the Swedes and was soon sunk, taking her captain and most of her crew with her to the bottom of Svensksund. But the battle was far from over. Soon the Swedish right flank was put under heavy pressure. The Russians hoped to force their way through the Swedish right flank to attack the Swedish center from the back. The Swedes soon realized that this was the plan and sent as many ships as they could spare to shore up the right flank. At the same time, the Russian attackers lost formation in the strait, where they didn't have all that much space to maneuver. This led to a bit of confusion, which the Swedes exploited in order to go on the offensive. The Swedish counterattack was successful and caused a lot of damage to the Russian ships. At around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Swedes even managed to send a contingent of ships through the shallow waters between two islands and attack the Russians from behind. When the commander of the Russian right flank ordered some of his ships to meet this new threat, the captains of some other Russian ships misinterpreted this as the beginning of a retreat, which caused confusion in the Russian fleet. Meanwhile, at the other side of the strait, renewed attacks against the Russian left flank ended with a total Russian collapse. Every single vessel on Nassau's left flank either fled, surrendered, or was sunk. Throughout the late afternoon, the Swedish fire was concentrated on the Russian center. As they were shot at from every direction, the wind had picked up and pushed the Russian ships deeper into the strait onto the firing Swedish cannons. To make matters worse, the Russian fleet didn't have enough room to move, and only a few of them could return fire without risking hitting their own ships. So they were all crammed together in the narrow waterway, with the Swedes firing at them from 3 sides and the strong wind pushing them deeper into the fire from the fourth. When the evening came, it was clear to everyone that the Swedes had won. Still, Nassau ordered the Russian center to continue fighting, despite its far from ideal position. Not until 8 o'clock in the evening did he order retreat, but by then it was too late for much of his fleet. The strait was dotted with sinking and burning Russian ships. Some captains even ignored the order to withdraw and instructed their crews to continue fighting until their ships sank. Sailors and soldiers from their sunken Russian ships swam to the islands surrounding the strait, where they were eventually captured by the Swedes. By the time the battle finally ended around midnight, the Swedes had lost 6 ships, 171 Swedes had died, and another 122 were seriously injured. We don't know exactly how many Russian lives were lost that day, but a low Russian estimate says 7,369 Russians died. But another Russian historian has set the number as high as 14,000. The Swedes who summarized the battle in the days after it had taken place claimed that at least 9,000 Russians had died. In addition, there were some 6,000 Russian prisoners. Somewhere between 50 and 80 Russian ships were sunk or captured by the Swedes. The day after the Battle of Svensksund, the king wrote to his BFF Gustav Moritz Armfelt that since the Battle of Narva, Sweden hasn't enjoyed such a complete victory. And he wasn't wrong. The Battle of Svensksund is Sweden's greatest naval victory, and counting the number of ships that participated, it's also considered the largest naval battle to ever take place in the Baltic Sea. The triumph was celebrated with a string of Te Deums, both in Finland and in Sweden. Karl Olof Kronstedt, the man who was credited with bringing about the victory, was appointed Naval State Secretary and dubbed a Knight of the Order of the Sword by the grateful king. 3 days after the battle, the news of the defeat reached St. Petersburg. Empress Catherine was shocked to learn that a significant part of her Baltic fleet had been annihilated and ordered the commanders who had participated in the fiasco to write reports explaining what had happened. Nassau, who had managed to escape being captured by the Swedes by the skin of his teeth, blamed the result on the cowardice of the Russian crews and claimed that the officers didn't follow his orders. Many of the others blamed Nassau for having attacked too hastily without knowing anything about the Swedish position in the strait. The consequences for Nassau were a little contradictory. On the one hand, Empress Catherine promoted him to admiral, but on the other, he was forced to resign from the Russian fleet. The victory at Svensksund changed everything. It had been clear for some time already that Sweden would not be able to win the war, but after July 9th, 1790, it had become equally clear that the Russians couldn't win either. So when the Russians offered to end the hostilities, Gustav III agreed, even though Prussia, Britain, the Netherlands, and the Ottoman Empire all lined up to offer Sweden money to keep the war going. The peace treaty was signed at Värele in Finland already on August 14th. The border between the two countries remained the same as it had been before the war, but Russia renounced its right to guarantee the Swedish constitution from the Age of Liberty, a right the country had received in 1721 as a part of the peace agreement after the Great Northern War. The Empress was willing to sign this peace treaty because to her the fighting in Finland had mostly been an annoying distraction. She wanted to focus all her military resources on fighting the Ottomans, and maybe have reserves to meddle in the political developments in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a state which was teetering at the brink of collapse at the time. The question of Russian guardianship over the Swedish political system had been a point of friction between the two countries for half a century, especially after Gustav III carried out his coup and abolished the Age of Liberty. The fact that Russia now officially recognized Swedish sovereignty without reservations was something that the King of Sweden could, and would, spin as a victory. But it was still far less than Gustav had hoped for, and the price had been terribly high, both for the country and for him personally. His reputation had taken a hit, and the weakness of his regime had been revealed for all to see. Worse yet, there had been people willing to exploit that weakness to try and get rid of him. Gustav had been genuinely shaken by the treachery of the officers at Anjala, but it hadn't broken him. Instead, he escalated the conflict with the Swedish aristocracy. We'll get into that in further detail next time. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.